it low. 0-1. 0-2. 0-3. Take me out to the lobby. Take me out to the lobby.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to our third Talking Baseball here in Buffalo, New York, presented by the Seasons of Buffalo Baseball, 1857 to 2020. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn over to Jim Overfield, the editor of the Seasons of Buffalo Baseball, who updated and revised his dad's 100 Seasons of Buffalo Baseball that was done in 1985. Jim?
Thanks a million for all the work you did on the book. Thank you for organizing the Talking Baseball features. Speaking from my office here in Essex, Vermont, and I'm happy to report that baseball is having a very good year in Vermont. My hometown, Essex, population 8,500, won the Little League, state Little League crown, and Owen Kellington, an 18-year-old right-handed pitcher from Montpelier High School, was the 102nd pick in the Major League Draft, the highest in human memory as far as I know. So remember that name, Owen Kellington. Final bit of good news has to do with the Vermont Lake Monsters. For years, we were a stalwart franchise in the New York Penn League, which of course was killed off by Major League Baseball last year. Happy to report that the Lake Monsters were reborn this year as a member of the New England Futures Collegiate Baseball League. They did very well. They won the pennant, won the playoffs. The last playoff game was played before more than 4,000 fans, standing room only crowd in Burlington's Centennial Field. So baseball appears to be alive and well in Vermont. How it's doing in the rest of the country, well, that'll be a subject that I'm sure will be talked about this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the, microphone over to our two MCs, Pete Weber, who was longtime voice of the Buffalo Bisons, member of the Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame, currently the voice of the Nashville Predators, and Stu Boyer, Buffalo-based sports journalist who just retired after a long and distinguished career with WGRZ. So Pete and Stu, I'm very happy to turn the mic over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Jim. Good report there on what's going on in Vermont. Stu sat with me many times, whether it was War Memorial Stadium or then Pilot Field, for Bison broadcasts over the years. So we were able to make good use of him back then. We're going to make good use of him here tonight as well. As he goes in, he has a little line of questioning. He'd like to begin with Bob Costas, editor. We have discussed earlier Bob's great book, Fair Ball by Bob Costas. Stu.
Thank you, Pete. And Bob, nice to meet you and see you. My question for you is one of them is, with all the great young talent in baseball nowadays, why do we keep setting record lows for ratings? What is baseball trying to do to pump up the game and connect with a younger crowd and get some TV ratings? And where do you see that among the problems facing baseball in this day and age?
Well, before I answer that, I'm just very relieved to learn that the Lake Monsters did so well, because I had always felt that the Lake Monsters were overrated. And I'm happy to be corrected and to have a much more sunny outlook concerning the Lake Monsters. I'm not sure how much sun actually creates the lake and when they emerge from the swamp to play. But in any case, this is heartening news. Hello, Harry. Hello, Harry. How are you? Awesome. In any case, here's the deal. Here's the deal in answer to your question. Baseball is brimming not only with excellent players, but with dynamic, charismatic young stars. I can't remember a better crop of young players in their early 20s or just hitting their prime. Remember, Mike Trout has been injured much of this year, is only 30 years old or 29, something like that. You've got a couple of dozen guys that have either establishing Hall of Fame credentials like Trout or have Hall of Fame potential. So it isn't an absence of talent. The problem with baseball, as everyone knows, is pace of play. Baseball is supposed to have a pleasing leisurely pace. It's not supposed to have a lethargic pace. You're not supposed to play a 4-2 game won by the home team. So it goes 8.5 innings and the game lasts 3 hours and 45 minutes. That's a problem. Now, in fairness, baseball does very well locally and regionally, very, very well. It's often during the summertime when other programming is in repeats or whatever it might be, the local baseball team is the highest rated thing. But nationally, it has not done as well. When you look at what World Series ratings were a generation ago, and now realize that there are World Series games that, depending upon the matchup and the circumstances, get lower ratings than regular season NFL games, that's a big step back for baseball. But I think the main thing that they want to address is pace of play, which is why Theo Epstein now works in Commissioner Manfred's office, and his assignment essentially is to rein in the monster that he and others helped to create through analytics and a different approach to baseball and having to use 6 pitchers to pitch a shutout, all those things, and defensive shifts and whatnot, all of which contribute to fewer balls in play and a more lethargic pace of play. That's the main issue that baseball faces, and they know it.
Another one for you. When I was a little kid, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Ernie Banks, there were many, many great black ball players. Nowadays, it seems like there are fewer and fewer black ball players. How does baseball reconnect with the black community and get young black kids to play baseball and get into the major leagues?
Well, they certainly are trying. You cannot fault them for lack of effort. The Reviving Baseball in the Inner Cities program, the RBI program, has been out there for quite a while. Baseball academies, all manner of outreach. The Players Alliance in baseball, which includes white players and Hispanic players, but is essentially driven by African-American players, has undertaken outreach to get kids more interested in baseball. Obviously, baseball wants to attract talent wherever they can find it. You've got players from Asia. You've got a handful of players from Australia, and some 30% plus of players in the major leagues have Hispanic backgrounds. So if you're talking about players of color, there are more players of color now than at any time in baseball history. But at one time, the number of African-American players was between 25 and 30%. Now it's in the high single digits, depending upon when the head count is taken. It's between 8 and 9%. And that's a tremendous fall off.
Bob, you had on your HBO show in the last 10 days or so, when I saw it, a great proposal for baseball, having overlooked, as it would turn out, Buck O'Neill, but then making up for it with the statue in Cooperstown to try to honor a guy who really had to go out on his own. He was out at the end of the plank in Curt Flood, who brought us to this free agency. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Well, when a special committee was charged with going back and looking over the history and including in the Hall of Fame Negro League players and contributors who had been overlooked, they came up with, I think, 17 different names. But one of them, almost inexplicably, was not Buck O'Neill. And there was such a public outcry over that the Hall of Fame immediately responded and made up for it by erecting a statue to Buck at the Hall in Cooperstown and naming an award, which is not given annually, it's given selectively, naming an award after him. He was the first recipient. Rachel Robinson is among the subsequent recipients. There have only been 4 or 5. It's for overall contributions to the game. And so with Marvin Miller finally going in tomorrow posthumously, and he always said, as long as I'm alive, I'll never be elected, because especially during most of his life, some of the attitudes may have softened more recently. as younger people have come in with a better understanding of the arc of baseball history. But a lot of old line baseball officials were very resistant and very resentful of Marvin Miller, who basically beat them at every turn in negotiations. And he always said, as long as I'm alive, I'll never be elected to the Hall of Fame. He actually at one point asked that his name be taken off the ballot because he realized it was such a farce. That never really happened, but he lived to be 95 and died in 2012, and he still hadn't been elected. And now here we are 9 years later. So he goes in posthumously. Don Fear, his longtime lieutenant who succeeded him at the head of the Players Association, will make the acceptance remarks, and carrying the torch for Marvin and knowing that Don never gave an inch himself in his many battles with baseball ownership. I wouldn't expect this tomorrow to be the most conciliatory speech. I'm sure there will be some pleasant tones struck, but I think that Don will make his points and make points on Marvin's behalf. But the thought occurred to me that Curt Flood is a perfect candidate for the Buck O'Neill Award for contribution to baseball. He was an excellent player, not quite Hall of Fame great, hit .293 lifetime, won 7 Gold Gloves, important part of 3 pennant winners in the 60s for the Cardinals and 2 world champions. And because of his significance in baseball history, a greater significance really than many Hall of Fame players, the combination of that and his significant baseball playing career make him a perfect candidate for the O'Neill Award, and now would have been the time. So when I suggested it, there were 12 days between the airing of that HBO show and tomorrow's inductions. And so far as I know, they have not heeded my suggestion. So the ceremony will come off without any mention of Curt Flood, unless, as is likely, Don Fear mentions him in his remarks.
So what do you think, Bob, about the overall effect of what we witnessed a few weeks ago, the game in Dyersville, Iowa, with the guys coming out of the cornfields, and then the corn stalks getting bent backwards with all the home runs in the game, but how meaningful that was to at least someone in my demographic who really grew up with that whole idea?
Well, it was the highest rated regular season baseball game since 2005. It got significantly higher ratings than many postseason baseball games do. Of course, you can't replicate that over and over again. And even if they go back to Dyersville, as they intend to in the future, and there I am in 2014 on the 25th anniversary of the game, talking at the Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner, even if they go back on an annual basis, it won't have quite the same aura surrounding it as the first time. Kevin Costner was a key component. He genuinely understands the meaning of this movie and the way it resonates with those that connect with it. He couldn't be a better spokesperson for that film and for its place in baseball history. Kevin is especially good and especially articulate about the films that he's been part of, especially those that are kind of in the pantheon that people still remember. And certainly among the handful that mean the most to him, Field of Dreams is one. So you had that perfect combination of circumstances. I know they'll go back there again. They'll look for special events, whether it's at the Field of Dreams or elsewhere. But you can't count on that on a regular basis. Those are like once a year type events. But they also illustrate what separates baseball from other sports. There's a generational connection and more of a nostalgia aspect to baseball, which people should not dismiss as, oh, that's just for older people. That's a get off my lawn thing. No, I understood the nostalgia aspect of baseball when I was 10 in 1962. It's always been part of it. Now, that doesn't mean that we want everyone to show up at the ball game on a trolley car, wearing a straw hat, smoking a cigar, and women get in for a quarter on ladies' day. But it does mean that we should not forget that that's an important component of baseball's appeal.
Absolutely important. Bob, would you like to bring in Harry Smith now, speaking about the Field of Dreams and his involvement with the coverage of that a few weeks ago? Because I think that was, well, you talk about resonating, that resonated with me as well, Bob.
Yeah, here is my friend Harry Smith. I was jealous. I was at home watching every bit of it. And Harry was at the Field of Dreams for the Today Show, just as he came up to Buffalo when the Blue Jays were playing there before they went back north of the border. I know Harry's a big baseball fan, and setting foot on that Field of Dreams must have really meant something to you, Harry.
You know, I went to college in Iowa, and so I pay attention to Iowa news, and the story of that movie being made there is something that I remember. And so when I heard that the game was finally going to be played, I said, we've got to go back and we've got to find these folks who own the property where the field was made, out of a cornfield, literally out of a cornfield. And it was beyond fascinating because the old man, Mr. Lansing, the Lansing family owned that property. And he talked about when the movie was finished filming, the crew turned to him and said, you know, we think there's something magic here. So the next spring, he had no thought, not a single thought of, I'm going to plow this over and replant corn. Let's just see what happens. And by golly, the first person who shows up is a young man on a cross-country trip. And in his hand, he hands old man Lansing a baseball cap, a New York Giants baseball cap. That cap is now in the little tiny museum on Main Street in Dyersville, Iowa. And he said, once that happened, literally as the words from the novel, as James Earl Jones spoke so eloquently, people did come. Ray, people will come. And they came in droves for more than a decade. So what we were doing there had less to do with Major League Baseball than having a chance to kind of come back and pay homage to the people in this town and the people who indeed helped give root to the mythology of this place.
Yeah, you know, Harry, I was lucky enough to do a version of the very same thing 7 years before you for the Today Show when Kevin came back along with Timothy Busfield and Dwyer Brown, who plays his dad in the most famous scene, Hey Dad, Want to Have a Catch? And Dwyer Brown told me in our conversation that day that to this day, he's a working actor, but that's still his most famous role from the late 1980s, that he will encounter strangers who will want to have a catch with him. And if there's no baseball available, he says, sometimes they roll up a piece of paper and we toss it back and forth, but he never says no. And, you know, one of the things about baseball is, at least that aspect of baseball, if you get it, there's no need for explanation. If you don't get it, no explanation
is possible.
You know, there's millions of people who really embrace this, and there are others who call themselves baseball fans who sneer at it. And I get both aspects of it.
No, listen, if you look, there's so many people who have written that movie was the worst baseball movie ever made because they said it had nothing to do with baseball, although the Black Sox, the Pujols Joe, et cetera, end up being sort of the fulcrum through which this whole story gets told. As I got to know these people in Dyersville, and I'm on the phone, I'm writing down telephone numbers like crazy, and I'm calling people at the Chamber of Commerce. What about this? What about this? And somebody said, well, has anyone told you about the ghost players? Well, there were all these guys who were semi-pro college players, junior college players, hard bat league players who came in and worked as stand-ins and as people who were placeholders. Like, okay, you need to stand in Kevin's place and whatever, as we frame the shot, what have you. These guys formed a kind of a troupe, and they dressed up in the old White Sox uniforms, and they ended up going all over the country touring to military bases. And they did this for years and years and years. So I met some of these guys, and you know, in the dream of television, you want 13 minutes for the piece, not 4 minutes and 7 seconds.
Right.
These guys told stories of how they would come and, you know, make an appearance on a Saturday or Sunday. One time, God's honest truth, this guy tells me, he says there was a family whose father was dying of cancer, and they were going to come and play a pickup game at the field. and the old man dies. And what happens? They bring the casket and they set it over home plate, and
Whoa.
the family played a pickup game. So in terms of transcendence, how that movie landed on so many people had meanings that we can't even fathom.
Yeah, it's true. You think back to when the Cubs and the Red Sox, the Cubs in 16, the Red Sox in 04, broke their respective curses. And we heard story after story of people going to cemeteries and dropping that morning's edition of the Boston Globe or the Chicago Tribune on their grandfathers or their fathers or their mom or their grandmother's grave and saying, hey, the Cubs finally did it. The Red Sox finally did it.
No, when the Maddox Cubs won, right, there was untold numbers of stories of we've got to go to Grandpa's funeral plot and do what, leave a W flag or whatever. Yes, absolutely true.
Harry, now we got to go to your connection with the natural and with wielding, if you will, Wonder Boy, and what that was like for you.
Well, so I had not been to Buffalo. Like, I mean, I think that I buzzed through there once or twice, not that it actually scratched my memory until several years ago. We actually went up there to do a story on the U.S. Paralympic sledge hockey team. And so that we were training up there. And so we were up there and I said, look at this city. This is the most beautiful, amazing architecture. I was just spellbound. And I walked around in the cold weather. And I said, oh my God, look at this, look at this, look at this. And I started to do homework and research on what Buffalo was about and where the, engine of commerce comes from and the Erie Canal. And here you are at the end of the Great Lakes. And the whole thing was fascinating to me. So we hear then that the Blue Jays are going to come out of Florida, and it's 1 year past the pandemic, and they're going to play these games in Buffalo. So the producer I work with, Joshua Janiak, starts making calls. I'm doing research, and he gets a hold of Bill, and I'm like, oh. Hang on. Give me 1 second. I lost my train of thought. And there's something going off on one of my other phones. So just bear with me. At least I got on time, okay?
Oh, wow. Wow, what a shot. Hey, now, Bob, did you ever interview Robert Redford about the natural, and where does that rank in your, we'll do a little interlude here until Harry gets ready.
No, I never did. We had an idea before I yield the floor once again to Harry, who you really want to hear from here. But we had an idea to entice Robert Redford to do it. He's pretty selective through the years about television that he does and interviews of any kind. And our idea was, if we could pair him with Ted Williams. He wore number 9 in the natural as an homage to Williams. Williams was his favorite all-time player. So the idea was, hey, if I will sit with you and Ted Williams and just get out of the way and let you and Ted talk, would you do that? And for some reason, we were never able to make that happen. And I think it would have been thrilling for Redford, thrilling for me, and Williams would have gone along with it. He's Ted Williams.
So we end up talking to Mike, and Mike says, oh yeah, you'll come over to War Memorial Stadium and and I've got this, and you look at the archive of this, and this happened and that, and we can connect you to 1 million people. And that's how we end up that day outside of what's left of the stadium with the amazing bat in my hands. And in my life, I don't know how to explain why I'm a baseball fan, because I never played a single second of organized baseball. I never swung a bat until I was in college and I'm playing softball with an intramural team. But for whatever reason, that first trip to the old Comiskey Park in Chicago, which was this rickety wooden thing with the exploding scoreboard, the days of Early Wynn and Minnie Minoso, something about all of that was completely spellbinding to me. So that the Blue Jays are going to play in Buffalo a team that at the turn of the last century was so yearning for Major League Baseball and had all of the qualifications, commerce, money, everything. And to have this dream finally come true, if only for a moment, really felt like a story worth doing.
So Harry, we just, thanks, those are great answers. We need to bring in Bob Nightengale from USA Today. And thank you all for joining us. And Bob, I guess our first question is, how great is it to actually have a Hall of Fame induction, even though it's at an unusual time? It's certainly better than it was a year ago.
Yeah, it's great. Particularly those guys have waited for so long. Talked to Ted Simmons about a week ago. He said, I don't have my speech memorized by now. I'll be brain dead. I've been practicing this thing for 2 years. So, it would have been a induction ceremony with probably over 100,000 people. Would have been a record under any normal year just because of Jeter. And Walker would have got a lot of fans too because of Canada. But just from what the Hall of Fame people are telling me, will probably be a little, less than 20,000 people, just one compact day instead of a whole weekend of parties and festivities and that sort of thing.
Have your feelings softened any on potential Hall of Famers from the steroid era? Or do you still feel the way you did in the beginning?
Well, I feel the same way, and I'm opposite of Bob. I vote for those guys. I really do. I voted for Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens from day one. I voted for Mike Piazza and Jeff Bagwell, Pedro Rodriguez, and others. I just think it's hard to separate. Too many guys. It was a wild, wild west. There was no testing back then. Hey, are you going to go the speed limit and there's no police cars around? No, you're not. There are too many GMs and managers that want their players to, get juiced up. There's too many Hall of Famers already in the Hall of Fame that were steroid users. So why punish the two best of that era? And of course, that's Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens.
Same question for you, Bob Costas. Has your opinion changed any on those potential Hall of Famers from the steroid era?
Well, just to clarify, I always made a distinction between Barry Bonds especially, and also Roger Clemens more or less in the same class. They clearly would have been first ballot Hall of Famers if they had not taken anything more powerful than a protein shake. Let's say if they'd retired in 1998. And that's generally when, according to Game of Shadows and what we can piece together and what the statistics tell us, that Barry Bonds decided after watching the summer of McGwire and Sosa, hey, I'm better than both these guys, which he was, better all-around player than both those guys. In fact, on his natural merits, had he never delved into PEDs, he would still have been in the conversation among the greatest all-around players of all time. He would have been a near unanimous first ballot Hall of Famer, and his public image would be much greater if he wound up with 600 home runs and somewhat lesser stats than going the route that he did, turning baseball into a video game. Others did it, but he took it to the greatest extent because he started out at the higher natural level. And apparently the people he worked with, the people at Balco and his trainer and whatnot were all, the top of the pyramid in that particular dark art. And it just worked better for him than it did for anybody else. But having said that, I make a distinction between him and Roger Clemens, who already had established Hall of Fame credentials before he might have done whatever it was we're led to believe he did. I put them in a separate category than Rafael Palmeiro, than Sammy Sosa, regrettably than Mark McGwire, whom I've always liked very much personally. And I think on his natural merits, had he been healthy, he would have been a Harmon Killebrew type Hall of Famer, not the great all-round player of a Barry Bonds or a Mays, a Mantle, and an Aaron or Mike Trout or someone like that, but certainly a guy who would have had Hall of Fame credentials. So I look at it not so much from a standpoint of morality, because when we start going down that road, or criminality, there are a lot of things that ball players who are in the Hall of Fame have done that were worse on a societal basis than taking steroids. But I do look at it from the standpoint of authenticity. Barry Bonds' records are not authentic. He was an authentically great player, one of the greatest of all time, but 762 lifetime and 73 in a season and a home run once every less than 7 at-bats, they are not authentic numbers. Neither are Sammy Sosa's numbers authentic, unless you think that he was 3 times more likely to hit 60 home runs in a season than Babe Ruth was. So that's the distinction I make. It's a distinction about baseball authenticity, not about morality. And I do put Bonds and Clemens in a slightly different class. And I would vote for them. But as you know, and as Bob Nightengale knows, broadcasters don't have a vote, only writers do. So I don't have to, I can just yammer about it, but I don't have to put pen to paper and check the box or not. Not allowed.
Can I add one tiny thought?
Sure.
Hello. Yeah.
Sure.
So that season, the Sosa, Mark McGuire season, when the balls are flying out of every stadium and in the National League that year, a producer I was working with was convinced that the baseballs were juiced. And we went to labs, we cut baseballs in half, baseballs from 10 years ago, baseballs from 5 years ago. We went to labs with automatic batting machines that we hit the ball and we check the velocity, all this stuff. And I remember trying to do this story about baseball being juiced. And we were in a major league clubhouse trying to ask players about the baseballs being juiced, and they looked at us like we were crazy because we didn't know what we were talking about.
Well, you know, Harry and Bob Nightengale should chime in on this. It wasn't just steroids, although that obviously was a huge factor. There was a confluence of circumstances. There were 2 expansions in the 90s, which watered pitching down, and the ball may have been juiced. And some of the new ballparks were more home run friendly, think Camden Yards in Baltimore, than other parks were. So it wasn't just steroids, but you can't discount steroids.
Bob Nightengale, you're not going to the ceremony tomorrow in Cooperstown because you would have no access to any of the players. I think that's something that's very evident now in all of sport. Access, not just to Hall of Famers, but to the everyday ball player, seems to have been cut off to a great degree.
Yeah, because of COVID. I mean, the Hall of Fame weekend, as Bob knows, it's such a wonderful weekend. My favorite weekend of the year. I've gone for 12, 13 straight years. But, you know, getting there on Friday morning and having the receptions at the Audacy Hotel, hanging downstairs in the bar till, you know, last guy leaves, all the parties and festivities on Saturday, then the speeches on Sunday. But, you know, hey, you're not allowed into the Audacy Hotel, which is understandable. Yeah, there's less than I think less than 25 Hall of Famers were actually going, you know, because of COVID restrictions and everything else. So, you know, I feel bad for, you know, Derek Jeter and Larry Walker and Ted Simmons that, you know, at least they're going to have people there, but it won't be quite the same. Hopefully those guys can have their big parties and stuff next year. Yeah, the Yankees will have theirs, the Cardinals will have theirs, and so on. Obviously the Colorado Rockies. So yeah, that's the reason. I'm going to New York, you know, 2 days later for the anniversary of 9/11. But just to go to the Hall of Fame to listen to speeches, I'll be listening to, you know, watching Bob's network on MLB Network, and, you know, writing it off the TV for the first time.
Great way to approach it. Absolutely. And I would think also that the Canadian Embassy will throw a huge party for Larry Walker.
They will. I mean, next year, I'm sure the Rockies will have their big party, and, you know, the Yankees will, and of course the Cardinals. But yeah, I mean, at least they're having this. It's better than just sitting in front of a TV camera without their friends and family being there. So they're very, you know, restricting who can even go into the hotel. I think just the guys going to the Hall of Fame, you're limited to almost like, I think, 2 hotel rooms at the Audacy, which is a gorgeous place. And that's a shame, but at least it's better than it was.
How would you rate Derek Jeter as a team executive so far? And where would you rate him on the list of all-time greatest shortstops?
Well, I put him, you know, top 5 of greatest shortstops ever. And the guy was just a winner. It drives you nuts with all those analytics and stuff. Say, well, he didn't have this range, he didn't do that, you know, wasn't doing this, but he knew where to play guys. You know, it's almost like Cal Ripken Jr. I mean, he knew where to play guys, and he was the ultimate winner, the ultimate competitor. One of my favorite players. I mean, you never heard one player say one negative word about Derek Jeter. As executive, I give him a lot of credit. They had a bunch of stars there, but he knew it wasn't working. So he's doing what the Cubs did and the Astros did, and what other teams have copied, is just stripping this thing down. So he dumped Stanton's contract, $365 million worth, onto the Yankees, which they regret. Traded away Christian Yelich, traded away Marcell Ozuna, and say, you know what, let's get back to where we want to be. And they're coming. They're about a year or two away, but it's a fun, exciting team. And it took Gus to do that. And also he had a palatial palace in St. Petersburg. I think it was about 30,000 square feet. He moved from there now and is living full-time in Miami, making this thing work.
And question for Bob Costas, if you're still here.
I am. Yeah.
There you are. About Jeter as an executive, and where do you rate him among the all-time great shortstops? Obviously, he's a Hall of Famer, but is he number one overall in your mind, or not quite there?
No, he's not number one overall, in all fairness. I mean, he's a great player. And he is, as Bob Nightengale said, one of the ultimate winners. And everything about what he projected speaks well of him and was an asset to baseball overall. But even though it's difficult to compare eras, you have to say that in the context of his time, nobody played shortstop better than Honus Wagner did. Honus Wagner was probably, pre-Ty Cobb, since he did predate him by a little bit. He was by consensus the greatest player. He was the greatest National League player of the first quarter of the 20th century, because Ruth and Cobb were both American League players. So you can't put Derek ahead. I guess you could look at Ripken having greater power, and Ripken was twice the MVP, and Derek was never the MVP. And although Alex Rodriguez has detractors as well as many fans, before he moved to third base to accommodate Jeter when he became a Yankee, you're looking at that kind of power and that kind of all-around game from a shortstop. Objectively, you couldn't put Derek ahead of him, but so what? I think a lot of times people you think of this LeBron, Michael Jordan thing, and it's an insult to whoever you put second. Do you know how great, when someone says that Babe Ruth or whomever, Willie Mays, was the greatest player, remember, that's EST. The other players in the Hall of Fame were also great. No one is going to, if we talk about the greatest players of all time, that tiny handful of inner circle Hall of Famers, does that mean that Carl Yastrzemski wasn't really great, and that somebody who grew up watching the Boston Red Sox doesn't have a feeling about Carl Yastrzemski that isn't based solely on objective achievement and statistics? It's based on the place that Carl Yastrzemski plays in that person's imagination and that person's baseball experience. I think sometimes, while it's certainly understandable that we debate these various things, we actually diminish the emotional impact when we try to reduce it all to facts and figures and analytics. Derek Jeter is one of the most significant players in baseball history, and he has a place in his generation that actually exceeds his objective achievements, as impressive as those objective achievements are. And I would leave it at that.
Everybody has their own favorites. So my favorite player all time, probably a guy that's, I think Bob was pretty close to, Stan Musial. But does that make him absolutely a number one, better than anybody else? No, but that's the beauty of this game. We all have our personal favorites, Bob.
Mm-hmm. And you could not create a list of the 20, let's say, greatest non-pitchers, the 20 greatest non-pitchers of all time, and exclude Stan Musial. Some people would say you couldn't even reduce that to 10 or a dozen and exclude Stan Musial. And if you grew up in the Midwest at a certain time, when the Cardinals were the southernmost and westernmost franchise in all of baseball, and KMOX was booming out throughout the country, or much of the country, some 30 to 40 states on a clear night with their 50,000 watt signal, and the Cardinal network had affiliates all around the South, the Southwest, the Midwest, Stan Musial meant something. Listening to Cardinal games on the radio, Harry Carey and Jack Buck in the 50s and 60s meant something. Baseball was the uncontested national pastime. Albert Pujols' numbers as a St. Louis Cardinal match up favorably and merit comparison with Stan Musial. But with all due respect to Albert Pujols, if somebody is 50 years old or older, 60 years old or older, there's no way that Albert Pujols could have the emotional effect on them and the place in their imagination that Stan Musial did. And I would also contend that because of the changes in the way people relate to baseball and baseball's now place in the sports firmament, that even someone who loved Albert Pujols, a 35-year-old guy now who followed Albert Pujols, I would respectfully suggest that Albert Pujols did not have the same effect on him that Stan Musial had on a comparable person in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s.
All right, we have one typed in question here. So let's go around the bend. What do we think about the robo-umps calling balls and strikes with effectively a radar gun? You want to lead off, Bob Costas?
Seems like I'm doing too much talking. Let me lateral the ball to mixed sports. Let me lateral or pitch out to either Harry or the other Bob.
But the other Bob should absolutely take this. No. Listen, for me, baseball is it's so much of what Bob was talking about, what the emotional connection. When my younger son and I go to games, and whenever I go to games, I still keep score. And we pass the score book back and forth. I was at a game at Citi Field a couple of years ago to watch Kansas City because Eric Hosmer was my pledge son's son, and we knew this kid when he was this big. So we've always been huge Eric Hosmer fans, but it's all these sort of intangibles in terms of place, as Bob was suggesting, the Cardinals in the 50s and the 60s, and how important it was for an entire region, or who you grew up watching. Or I remember watching Brooks Robinson play third base. I just thought it was beyond balletic. It was and beyond my comprehension. And so you have these things that lock into your brain that you say, that's why I love this. That's why I love this. So if they use a gun or not, I want to see the occasional blowups when the player who strikes out throws down the bat, goes face to face, the manager comes out of the dugout. There's some of that. I don't want to lose that theater.
Bob Nightengale, what would you think would happen with Billy Martin or Earl Weaver going out trying to argue with a robo-ump?
I don't know what they do. They just pull up the cord now or shout at the computer screen. I don't want to see it. I think it just takes away the human element of the game. Too many guys are complaining like the ball is just this far outside the plate, and they're calling a strike. Swing the bat. Joey Votto's getting more praise this year than probably any other year because he's hitting home runs. It's like Dusty Baker, when he was managing Joey Votto. Joey, you're not doing us any good by taking a walk and clogging up the base pass. We need you to swing and drive in runs. I think these players now, too often, they go back to the bench, look at the computer monitor and say, see, you missed it by 1/8 of an inch. I would like to see the guys swing the bat more. And I don't want to see the robo-umps, but I'm sure they're coming.
Panelists, what do you think of the ghost runners and extra innings starting out on second base? I see a grin beginning there, Mr. Nightengale.
It sounds like it's going to come back next year too. I mean, Rob Manfred at the All-Star game kind of misspoke a little bit, like it was going away. But I think I'd like to see it maybe in the 12th to 13th inning. The one thing I will say, I was doing a little round table with Anthony Rizzo and Chris Bryant a couple of springs ago. And I think it was Rizzo that said, when you look at the sports, we have the most boring overtime of all the major ones. With the hockey shootout, of course, the sudden death in the NFL and football and basketball. And he's right. I mean, the one thing I will say, and Bob can attest to this, when the 10th inning rolled around, everybody hedged the exits, like we've seen enough baseball. Now you're seeing fans stay like, okay, it's about to end. At least there's a guy in second base starting. So I don't mind it. I wouldn't want to see it in the 10th inning anymore. But maybe if you want to do it the 12th or 13th inning, that's fine.
Yeah, I'd be good with that. The 12th inning seems about right. You get a lot of lineup turnover, playing regular baseball in the 10th or the 11th. And I wouldn't want to see it at all in the postseason. And they didn't use it last year in the postseason and will not going forward. So that's a good thing. But one thing I haven't heard mentioned often enough, Michael Kay mentioned it the other night on a Yankee game that went into extra innings. There is a huge advantage now in batting last under those circumstances. It's always an advantage to be home, playing on your home field and have last licks, so to speak. But now you don't know, with the guy on second base in the top half of the 10th, or if it goes on to the 11th or beyond, you don't know if you should play for the single run or if you need more than that. But if you are able to hold them scoreless in the top half of the inning and now you come up, now you know that small ball will win the game. You know that you can bunt or poke a ground ball to the right side and you can put something together. Here's something, though, that I've thought of, maybe because I have too much time on my hands. And I mentioned it to Buck Showalter on a broadcast once, and he looked at me like I had two heads. But then he said, when we went to commercial, that's really interesting. They're playing 7-inning games in doubleheaders. Let's say a guy's pitching a perfect game, but the game is scoreless. He's set down 21, but now we go to extra innings. And extra innings now is the 8th, okay? We start out with a guy on second base. They bunt, they throw the guy out. Sacrifice fly, then the next guy's retired. He's still pitching a perfect game. His team scores in the bottom half. He goes back out in the 9th. The same thing happens. He's faced 27 hitters, 27 up, 27 down, but now he's losing 2-1. And his team does not score in the bottom of the 9th. For all intents and purposes, he's pitched a perfect game and he's lost 2-1. How are you going to explain that to somebody? A perfect game in which the opposition scored twice.
Wow. Bob, congratulations on being on TBS to call the NLCS. Do you have a dream matchup for this season?
I'm not calling the NLCS. Brian Anderson will do that. I'm hosting it because the NBA season starts early this year. It starts on October 19th. So Ernie Johnson, who of course has to be there with Barkley, Shaq, and Kenny Smith because that's their signature show. He can host the division series, but he can't host the NLCS. My old friend Jeff Zucker, whose first job out of Harvard was as my researcher and Brian Gummel's researcher at the '88 Seoul Olympics, then went on to run the Today Show and run all of NBC Universal. He now runs not just CNN, he now runs Turner Sports. So he reached out to me on a one-off to say, will I host it? So yeah, I'll host it, but I'm not doing the play-by-play. I think the dream matchup is probably, from a rating standpoint, is probably Dodgers, Yankees, but either the Giants or the Dodgers would be terrific stories nationally. The Giants have had a magical season. The Dodgers have done what their payroll and their roster indicates they should have done. But as Bob Nightengale can pick up here and tell us, there are a lot of stories beyond the biggest markets. I mean, Chicago's a big market, but La Russa and the White Sox are a very compelling story. The Milwaukee Brewers are a compelling story. Take it, Nightengale.
I mean, the way it looks like now, the first round is going to be the Houston Astros and Chicago White Sox, which is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Dusty Baker and Trey La Russa's had that rivalry forever. 76 years old, 72 years old. I think it'll be fascinating. In the first round, it looks like if the Giants or Dodgers loser wins that wild card game, Dodgers Giants in the first round of the playoffs, first time they've ever met in history. That would be a fun series.
Although you wish somehow that they could meet in the longer LCS, one step from the World Series. That would seem even more dramatic, but we'll take what we can get.
Then if it's Milwaukee, Tampa, we may be like the old days of the NBA, maybe just a delayed World Series game, state delayed.
Yeah. They had Milwaukee, Phoenix for the NBA.
Right.
Milwaukee, Tampa for baseball would be perhaps even worse, if that's the right way to put it. No disrespect to the Suns, Bucks, Rays or Brewers, but it's not a television bonanza, that's for sure.
Kaz Rodriguez asked this question: with the future of the Oakland A's uncertain and the success that the Blue Jays had in Buffalo, do you think that ever gives Buffalo a chance to get an MLB team?
I haven't heard that city come up at all. I mean, one time they're talking about a team in Central Jersey. Remember, Bob, years ago?
Mhm.
But the two cities you hear the most now is Nashville, Tennessee, and Montreal. Montreal gets a ballpark. They got one for sure. Nashville, Dave Dombrowski's convinced it was going to go there. That's why he joined an ownership group. Those two teams, those two cities jump out the most. Then you hear Portland, a little bit Charlotte, and Vegas, although I'm not sure Vegas will work. It has a hard time surviving up in Phoenix, which is a much bigger city than Las Vegas.
We ought to throw this Pete's way, because as the voice of the Nashville Predators, he knows that a lot of people think that Nashville would be a good baseball market, so much so that the Atlanta Braves don't want them in their relative backyard because the Braves are a regional franchise. What do you think the chances are?
Yeah,
Pete?
and that's talked about quite a bit. I'm part of a Monday morning breakfast group that includes the founding owner of the Nashville Sounds franchise, Larry Schmittou. We are constantly discussing that and talking about how Nashville fits, if you will, in between or among St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Atlanta. And thanks to traffic patterns, at best, you're going to get to Atlanta in 2.5 hours. And that is going to be truly a rarity to be able to do that. But the baseball fans here have been strong for many years. This ownership group appears to be pretty well heeled and willing to spend money even to build the facility in which they would pay, not to mention to purchase the team itself. So I'm thinking that this is something that is very seriously being considered.
Yeah, there's resistance, though, not just from the Braves, but you mentioned the Reds.
Yes.
They both franchises consider Nashville to be at least a part of their fan base. And to Bob's point about Montreal, again, there are diehard fans, some in St. Petersburg. But when you have a team as good as the Rays have been, and they've had 10 crowds this year of less than 10,000, even we're not post-COVID, but even after vaccinations became available and the gates were open to allow fans in, they just don't have the fan base. They don't have the ballpark. If they were to relocate, for the sake of argument, to Montreal, they're still in the American League East. And now it really makes sense. Montreal would have a natural rivalry with Toronto. They'd have proximity to Boston, to New York. It would make sense up and down the Eastern Seaboard. You include Baltimore there. The whole division would make tremendous sense, both competitively and geographically. And that would also, of course, greatly disappoint fans in Buffalo. I get that. Yep. But Montreal is a larger metropolitan area.
Bob Costas, you are a legend. We thank you very, very much. You know, you're beloved in
thank you,
Buffalo.
Mike.
You know, the Bills Mafia, they start this weekend. And my prediction is when the Bills are announced, a full house at Highmark Stadium, Buffalo has a chance of setting the largest noise record.
Well, you can't forget about the Metrodome when the Twins played there, because when you got a place that's enclosed, I mean, they actually measured it, and it was louder than if you stood on the tarmac when a 747 was taking off.
Well,
I agree with Bob. When people talk about stadium noise, nothing like the Metrodome in the 87-91 World Series.
Yeah.
And I could be sitting next to Bob or whoever in the press box and scream, and he could not hear me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people still have some hearing problems from that series. It was deafening.
Without headphones.
My great friend Al Michaels said, who's calling the 87 World Series, and at one point he said, now we know what sound feels like.
Well, you have given us a great challenge to give to the Bills Mafia. And Harry, this may be a great story for you to come up here for a tailgate party with the Bills Mafia before a Bills game, especially a Monday night game.
I want to see Harry in the hot tub.
Harry, thank you very, very much for joining
Pleasure.
us. Bob, enjoy, and thank you very much. Your friend Eric Brady sends his very best to you.
Yes.
Our wishes for a best of the end of the baseball season. And you talk about Tampa Bay. We're now in AAA, as you know, here in Buffalo, and Major League Baseball controls, and the team with the best record and it's Durham, and they're the AAA team of the Tampa Bay. Although Buffalo's on an 8-game winning streak, and they're AAA of the Blue Jays, and they're close.
You know, that's all very interesting, but all I care about outside of the major leagues is the lake monsters. Don't bother me with anything else.
Well, one of our guests who's on the show tonight, we brought him on the last show, and that's Willie Hutch-Jones. Willie Hutch is a former Vanderbilt basketball player. Pete, you want to talk about Willie from your days as a broadcaster?
Well, from my days as voice of the Albuquerque Silvers of the Continental Basketball Association, when Hutch was playing for the team in 1983 that Pat McKernan rescued from Las Vegas. Yes, Hutch, special ball player.
Well, and then Willie Hutch came back here after playing with the Lakers and in Europe,
Yep.
and he formed the Willie Hutch-Jones Educational and Sports Program that is now in its 37th year of giving back to the inner city here in Buffalo and Western New York. And right now he's vacationing in North Carolina, and he's spending the day with former Bison Morris Madden, who has a similar inner city program. So I think between those two, they may answer Stu's question, and we may grow some nice young black ball players, and we're at least training them. And the good news is that because of Jim Overfield and proceeds from our book, proceeds from the 26 shirts that we sold of the vintage Bisons, and proceeds from the Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame, the program was off to a great success. Through it, Major League Baseball came down and has awarded Hutch's program an RBI franchise.
Great.
Wow.
On September 18th, Saturday, we're having our first Major League Baseball RBI pitch, hit, and run competition at the old War Memorial Stadium, the Johnny B. Wiley Amateur Sports Pavilion, starting at 9:30. Go to whjsc.org for complete details, but every participant is going to get a voucher for a ticket for the September 25th Saturday Bison game, where Jim Overfield will be in and will be presenting a Seasons of Buffalo Baseball book to Casey Kendall. From our end here on the grandest island, this has been terrific. I thank our executive producer, Christina App, for her third straight A++, and Tom Wolf, who has stepped in for Mark Odeon, who has pulled it off marvelously. We thank you all very much. Jim Overfield.
Well, I don't have too much more to say. It's been a great show, and thank you, Mike, for putting it together, and all the participants for taking time out from their busy schedules. But I thought about doing revision and expansion of my dad's 1985 book, The 100 Seasons of Buffalo Baseball. I never in a million years thought I'd be sitting here holding this beautiful book in my hands, a book that's been very well received, kindled countless memories for people who have bought it and have looked through it. The feedback has been great, and to have it publicized by Harry Smith and Bob Costas is just, as I said, it's beyond my imagination and my belief. And so I'd just like to close by, thanking everybody, Mike, my wife Susan, countless people who contributed pieces to the book for your efforts. It was a great experience, and looking forward to doing another revision in about another 5 years.
And Jim, we have on the broadcast here two of our contributors, Paul Langendorfer, who also wrote a book on Buffalo baseball, but also Bud Bailey, who authored countless numbers of books. Bud, can you give us your 2 cents on what you observed tonight and your review of the book?
Well, having written the Bob Rich part of the book, Mike, I'm a little biased on that, but I look forward to using it as a reference source for hopefully years to come. The Joe Overfield books were very valuable. In fact, they fell apart as everyone else's did after 30 years. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this one, and I'm looking forward to using it.
Thank you. And we all still have on because his popcorn has not run out. Professor, oh, look, oh my gosh, you got to turn on a movie. Harry, you're a great storyteller. Finish us up tonight with a closing story to wrap all this up.
So I fall in love with baseball as a kid. And as I said earlier, I never played a second of organized ball. I don't know why it's had this power over me, but it did. And it's the late 60s. I'm the youngest of 8 kids. All my older brothers all served in various branches of the military. And my brother closest in age to me was being shipped out after having done his basic training at Great Lakes Naval Station. So we're in O'Hare Airport waiting to see my brother off as he's heading off to San Diego to get on an aircraft carrier to go to Vietnam. And I see a guy get off a plane with a peg leg. And I see, that's Bill Veeck. So I go over and I said, Mr. Veeck, I'm Harry Smith. And, I think you're amazing. And he says, kid, you want to carry my bag? And I carried Bill Veeck's bag all the way out to the parking lot at O'Hare Field, which was then about this big, by the way. But you know what? It's interesting. I thought Bob really nailed it. Just how a game, some of us played, some of us did not, can have such a power over us. And I loved what you guys were talking about, the ideas of how do we get more people into the seats? How do we get people to understand why everything that happens, every single second in the baseball game actually matters, right? That ball too, what does that mean to the guy who's up at bat? What does it mean in the pitcher's head? What does it mean to the outfielders? Or what was referred to about Jeter? Jeter understood who was up at bat. He moved according to what they would predictably do or not do in a given situation, right? That's not teachable. It's not understandable unless you really pay attention, right? So in that regard, I thank you so much for the opportunity to share a couple of anecdotes with you guys. And I love listening to the conversation. And, one of these days, you never know, might make it up for a Bison's game.
We've had a great time tonight. We've talked about something that is very important to each and every one of us in our own individual ways. And I think that was what was pointed out so well here this evening. I'm a Stan Musial guy, and I think Jim Overfield probably is still thinking about Luke Easter. And who knows, Minnie Minoso for Harry Smith. Because Minnie Minoso was a big favorite of mine as well growing up. And for Bud Bailey, so some of you don't know, he was there in Fenway Park in 1960 when Ted Williams hit his last major league home run. Wow. I can't think of a better way to cap this up here tonight than to say all of us have had our different experiences with the game and all of us still love it. And we thank you for your attention here tonight.
Oh, it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the